Deep in the middle of the woods, said my mother, is the place where the king of the pumpkins lives. But pumpkins live in fields, not in the forests. I said to my mother. She wouldn't listen to me. I'm telling you, she said. The king of the pumpkins lives in the middle of the woods, and the woods that he lives in are the woods right next to our house. The woods you can see out of the window over there. She pointed with her hand to the woods that were, in fact, just outside the window behind our house. He doesn't live in a field like the other pumpkins, continued Mother, because he's not an ordinary pumpkin. He's a king pumpkin. I shut up and decided to believe her, like you do when you're a kid. Firstly, firstly, I knew that it wasn't worth arguing with my mother. She always won. Secondly, when you're a kid, you always believe what grown-ups tell you, no matter how stupid it is, like Santa Claus, stuff like that. Kids always believe it, even though they know it's stupid. Still, I decided to go and find the king of the pumpkins, probably because I was bored, probably because I was curious, and also, of course, because I wanted to know if my mother really was talking nonsense or not. Mother often talked nonsense. I have to say that. There was a time she told me that the moon was made of cheese. I knew that was nonsense. Then there were all the stories she told me. Stories about frogs, princesses, princes, and shoes. Stories about donkeys and unicorns, gnomes in, what is it? Uh, elves. hmm Elves. Magic mirrors and magic cooking pots. Stories about why the stars are exactly the way they are. Why the river that runs through our town has the name that it has. Stories about where the sun comes from. Why the sky is so far away and why the elephant has a long trunk. Some of these stories, I think, might have been true. I was never sure, and it was difficult to find out. This time, though, with this story about the king of the pumpkins, it was going to be easy to find out if she was telling the truth or not. Some people used to call my mother a witch, but I knew that she wasn't a witch, just a bit strange perhaps, and she used to talk nonsense. Perhaps it was also because of the black cat we had. People say that witches always have black cats, and we had a black cat, but cat, a witch cat. He was just a regular black cat. Mark could talk, though. I have to say that perhaps that isn't so regular in a cat, now I think about it. Anyway, I was telling you about the time I went to find the king of the pumpkins. I set off with Mark the cat into the woods to look for the king of the pumpkins. Even though we'd lived in that house near the woods all my life, I had never gone into the middle of the woods. This was the first time. I was glad. I was glad I had Mark with me. I was a bit scared, even though I didn't really think that the king of the pumpkins lived here. Watch out for the wolves, said Mark. Yes, and the grandmothers too, I joked. Let's not leave the path, said Mark. When people said my mother was a witch, I told them that witches don't have children. Yeah, they replied. That's true, but you look more like an elf than a regular kid. Mm, elf. I think I looked like a regular kid, but you never can tell really. Do you think he's real? I asked Mark. Who, the wolf? He certainly is, replied Mark. No, not the wolf. I know the wolf is real, I said to Mark. Sometimes I could hear the wolf howling in the night at night. I knew he was real. No, not the wolf. The king of the pumpkins. Do you think he's real? Don't know, said the cat. Guess we'll just have to find out. We walked on into the forest. The trees got taller and taller and taller. The paths got narrower and narrower and narrower. What does he do, then the king of the pumpkins? Asked Mark. I don't know really, I said. I guess he just kind of is head pumpkin, boss pumpkin. He decides on pumpkin rules and pumpkin laws and punishes people who break them. Oh, I see, said Mark. He was quiet for a bit, then said, what kind of things are pumpkin rules then? Um, how big you can grow, what color you have to be, stuff like that. You're making this up, aren't you? Asked Mark. Yeah, I said. Eventually, we got to the middle of the forest. At least, I think it was the middle of the forest. But it's difficult to say exactly. There was a clearing, a big space where there were no trees. In the middle of the clearing was the king of the pumpkins. At least, I think it was the king of the pumpkins. It looked like a man at first. He was quite tall and had legs and arms made from sticks. He was wearing an old black coat. His head was a pumpkin. His head was the biggest pumpkin I had ever seen. Me and Mark went up close to him. He didn't say anything. Is that it? Is that it? Asked Mark. I guess so, I said. Disappointing, said Mark. Do you think he's the real king of the pumpkins? I asked Mark. Who knows? Replied the cat. As we walked back along the path out of the forest, I started to think about what was real and what was not. Could things that were made up also be true? Be true. What was the difference between story and history? One is real and the other isn't. Is that it? What about all those other things that mother talks about? Do you think they're real? I asked Mark. I'm not sure, said Mark. Those stories she tells sometimes about why the night is black and the day is blue, about golden eggs and girls with golden hair, about why people have 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 feet, 2 hands, and 2 eyes. Sometimes I think she's crazy, and sometimes I think she might be right. I know that Mark meant I felt the same way. Perhaps the stories aren't true as that, but what they mean is another story. The next story is Mr. Smith's new nose. Mm. I think that I read this story before. Well, Mr. Smith, if you prefer a different type nose, we have a large selection available. I think this nose is a bit too small. Small noses are very fashionable this year, Mr. Smith, very fashionable. Do you think it suits me? Asked Mr. Smith. I think it looks very nice, said the shop assistant. Okay, I'll take it. On the airbrushed phone, Mr. Smith called his wife on his wrist phone. Hello, dear. Do you like my new nose? Mrs. Smith looked at her husband's new nose on the video phone monitor on the wall in the kitchen. I think it's a bit too small, dear, she said. Small noses are very fashionable this year, replied Mr. Smith. Very fashionable. It's all so easy now, thought Mr. Smith. 100 years ago, It was impossible to change your body, or almost impossible. There was the old fashioned plastic surgery, but it was expensive, painful, and dangerous. Mm, thanks to our 22nd century genetic engineering, we can change our bodies when we want. He looked at his new small nose in the mirror and thought about how fashionable he was. He was very happy with his new nose. The only problem now, he thought, was that he needed some new hair to go with his new nose. He looked on the internet for some new hair, but the internet was so slow. Eventually, he decided to go to body code in person. Good morning, Mr. Smith, said a body code shop assistant. How can I help you today? Mr. Smith remembered the robot shop assistant in a body code shop a few years ago. The robot was friendlier and more efficient, but too many robots made too much unemployment, and the robot was replaced by a human. I'd like some new hair, please. Certainly, Mr. Smith. What type of hair would you like? Short blonde hair goes well with a small nose. How about short blonde hair? Mr. Smith looked at his hair. It was old and gray. Yes, he thought, short and blonde. When he was young, he had short blonde hair. He wanted to look young again. Yes, I'll have short blonde hair, please. Could it be a bit curly as well? Curly? Asked the assistant. Yes, you know curly, not straight. Yes, Mr. Smith, I know what curly means, but curly hair isn't very fashionable this year, isn't it? No, it isn't. But I like curly hair. Very well, Mr. Smith. Short, blonde, curly hair. Would you like anything else? We have a special offer on ears this week. Ears? Yes, Mr. Smith. The things you hear with. I know what ears are. What type of ears are on offer? Mr. Smith went out of the shop with new short blonde curly hair and two new ears. After this, his interest in his new body started to grow. In the next few weeks, he bought new eyes, green, unusual but fashionable. New hands, new arms, new knees, and new feet. Mrs. Smith was happy because Mr. Smith's new feet didn't smell as bad as his old feet. His body was now completely different. Am I the same man I was a few weeks ago? Thought Mr. Smith. I have a new nose, new hair, new ears, new eyes, hands, arms, knees, and feet, but I have the same brain, so I think I'm the same man. He thought he was the same man, but he wasn't sure. One morning he woke up and his new nose didn't work. What's the matter? Asked Mrs. Smith. My new nose doesn't work. It's blocked. Maybe you've got a cold, suggested Mrs. Smith. That's impossible. This is a genetically engineered body code nose. It doesn't get colds. But it was true. The new nose didn't work. It was blocked, and Mr. Smith couldn't smell anything. He went back to the body coat shop. Good morning, Mr. Smith, said the assistant. What would you like to do? What would you like today? I want a new nose, said Mr. Smith. You already want a new nose? Said the surprised shop assistant. But you've only had this one for a month. Don't worry, small noses are still fashionable. No, you don't understand, said Mr. Smith. I want a new nose because this one doesn't work. That's impossible, said the shop assistant. You have a genetically engineered body code nose. It can't go wrong. But it has gone wrong, replied Mr. Smith. It's blocked and I can't smell anything. What have you used your nose to do? Mr. Smith asked the shop assistant. What have I done with my nose? That's a stupid question. I haven't done anything unusual with my nose. I've used it to breathe and to smell as usual. If you have not used your nose correctly, Mr. Smith, it's impossible that it will not work correctly. That's Absurd. Absurd. What this one? Absurd. Absurd or absurd? What?
Absurd.
Absurd. Absurd. That's absurd. Shouted Mr. Smith. I want my money back. I want a refund. I'm afraid that we do not give refunds, Mr. Smith. There was no guarantee with this nose. Mr. Smith was so angry that he didn't know what to say. He walked out of the shop and didn't say anything. But now he had a big problem. A useless nose, fashionable, yes, useful, no. Unfortunately, his problem started to grow. The next morning he woke up and felt he couldn't hear anything. Then his new blonde hair went gray. Then his new knees didn't move. Then he couldn't see a thing with his unusual green eyes. His fingers fell off one by one. Eventually, Mrs. Smith put him in their air car and flew to the body coat shop. She carried her husband into the shop because now he couldn't walk. Good morning, Mr. Smith, said the shop assistant. What can I do for you today? Mr. Smith wouldn't like anything new at all today, thank you, replied Mrs. Smith. But he would like his old body back. I'm afraid we don't give refunds, Mrs. Smith. I don't want a refund, explained Mrs. Smith. I want my husband's original body again. I liked it more than this new one. I'm afraid that's very difficult, Mrs. Smith, said the shop assistant. We are an environmental friendly company. All our old bodies are recycled. But the new body parts that you sold him don't work. What can he do now? He could buy a reconditioned body. What's a reconditioned body? It's an old body that has been modified. Can I have a look at one? Certainly. The shop assistant spoke to his computer and a reconditioned body appeared. It was a very familiar body. Mrs. Smith recognized the big nose and the gray hair. But that's my husband, shouted Mrs. Smith. That's the original Mr. Smith. Yes, that's right, said the shop assistant. We reconditioned Mr. Smith's old body. Can he have his old body back then, please? Certainly. Mrs. Smith, let's be 100,000 euros, please. 100,000 euros? Shouted Mrs. Smith. That's very expensive, isn't it? Mrs. Smith has been reconditioned. Mr. Smith got his own body back, and Mrs. Smith flew him back home in the air car. I'm myself again, he shouted. Not exactly, said Mrs. Smith. You have been reconditioned. What does reconditioned mean? Well, said Mrs. Smith, I think it means that you have a new brain. I think that will be very useful, said Mr. Smith. I think so too, dear, said Mrs. Smith. The next story. Olive. Here's Scarlett. In the garden of a friend's house in London on a sunny summer morning, the kind of mornings that are unusual in England. Scarlett is 12 years old, 13 in November, she tells me, and is trying to understand the world around her. She asks questions about everything all the time. I tell her that I want to ask her a question, and I ask her why she is called Scarlett and what the name means, and if it comes from anywhere in particular. And she says, no, it's just a stupid name my parents chose because they liked it. It doesn't mean anything. I wondered if her parents named her after the heroine of a favorite film, perhaps, but then again, I know her dad and This sounds unlikely. I think they probably chose it just because they liked the sound of it. Scarlett is worried about changing school after the summer. She worries that she is too short for her age and that the other children at the school will make fun of her. She shows me some pictures of the school she is at now and her classmates. I look at the picture and it shows children of all heights and shapes and sizes. Some are all tall, some are short, some are fat, and some are thin. Some are black and some are white, and most of them are somewhere in between. Some have red hair and some have blonde hair, some have long hair and some have short hair. I tell her not to worry about the new school, tell her that she'll be okay, and ask her about the new subjects she'll be studying. She tells me that she's worried about learning French, and I tell her not to worry. That it is a very difficult language. She tells me that she already knows 5 languages. 5 languages, I shout. That's impossible. How do you already know 5 languages? Because I've got 5 languages in my body, she said. I asked her what she means, and she starts to tell me the story of her family. Some of the story I already know. I've already heard stories about her grandfather. He was from Scotland. He was a sailor, but not a very good sailor. So he only got as far as Portsmouth, a big navy town on the south coast of England, not very far from Scotland at all. When he got to Portsmouth, he stopped there, left the navy, and became a boxer. He lost fights and drank a lot. However, he still managed to see the world by meeting a woman who came from Laos. Nobody really knows how this woman had ended up in Portsmouth, but she still lives there, and I tell Scarlett and that she should try and find out her grandmother's story. No, she's too old now, says Scarlett, and anyway, she's lived in Portsmouth nearly all her life. Scarlett's grandparents were only together long enough to produce a son, probably one of the only Scottish Laotians in the world. They called him Bill, which is usually short for William, but his name was just Bill. Bill inher- oh, mm, inher- inherit, inherited,
Inherited.
inherited. Mm. They called him Bill, which is usually short for William, but his name was just Bill. Bill inherited inherited his father's personality and his mother's looks. So the only thing he thought he could do was become a rock star. He never really managed to become a rock star, though. So now he works as a graphic designer. I don't know Scarlett's mom, so I asked her to tell me about her mom. My mom's Polish, she says. Well, not really, because she was born in Brighton, but her mom and dad are from Poland. But they've lived there like for always. But I know that her mom was from somewhere that was Germany and then became Poland. So she's really German, I suppose. So that's another language that I've got in my body. I asked Scarlett if she can actually speak all the languages that she says she has in her body, and she looks at me like I'm stupid. Of course not, she says, but I've still got them in me. We count up her languages: Scottish, Laotian, some German, Polish. That's only four, I tell her. No, that's English too. Of course there is, I say. And then I looked at Scottish, Russian, German, Polish, English Scarlet. Was her name that comes from nowhere? And I asked her, and you, Scarlet, where are you from? She thinks for a long time, such a long time, that I think perhaps she hasn't heard my question. But then, before I can repeat it, she looks up and at me. I'm from here, she says. I'm from London. The next story, The Birth of a Star. Wow, Mr. Smith, if you prefer a different type of nose, we have a large. Oh, no, 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 not this story. Not this story. Mm. Mm. The Birth of a Star. 5 June. Mm. The 5th of June to 2006. Henry looks carefully into the telescope, which lets him see far away as the distant. Mm.
Nebulae.
Nebulae. Uh, as far away as the distant nebulae on the far edges of the Milky Way, Henry is an astronomer. He looks at the sky and at stars in particular. Even though he spends much of his time looking at detailed computer reports, which are just lists and lists of numbers, his favorite thing about his job is looking through the telescope. And today he is very excited. He isn't sure yet, but he thinks he has seen a dense cloud which might be the beginning of a new star. The 5th of July, 2006, Henry is still looking for a tiny point of light in the sky. He checks the lists and lists of numbers that his computer produces and tries to make sense of them. He tries to turn the basic data into an image, a picture of the star he hopes to see, but it is not yet possible. He arrives home feeling tired. His wife Anna sits down next to him. I've got some news, she says. The 5th of August, uh, 2006. Henry is so excited about being a father that he has forgotten about his star. Anna is feeling sick and tired. Henry is no longer thinking about nebulae, nebulae and clouds and gases. He is thinking about push chairs and nappies. The 5th of September 2006, Anna and Henry go to the doctor. Anna has an ultrasound scan. Henry is used to seeing uh, distant images of planets and stars and clouds, and now he looks at his this image. It almost looks like a cloud, but it is much clearer. He can see the outline of the head, the features of a face, and he realizes that this means much more to him than the distant stars he is used to looking at. The 5th October 2006, Anna finally starts to get better. Henry is feeling terrified. For the first time now, he realizes exactly what it means. In a few months' time, he will be a father. The 5th of November 2006, Anna looks at her tummy and now starts to feel that there is another living person inside her. She thinks about Henry's job and remembers how excited Henry was a few months ago. when he thought that he could see a new star. Number the 5th of December 2006, Henry thinks that Anna looks a bit like a whale, but that she is very beautiful anyway. He thinks that next Christmas everything will be very, very different. The 5th January 2007, Anna feels like she wants to sleep all the time. She feels like the baby already wants to come out. The baby is kicking her from inside. She feels like a football. She can't wait to become a mother. Henry calls her 10 times a day on her mobile phone. The 5th of February 2006 or 2007, it can take as long as 10 million years for a star to form, but Henry doesn't care about seeing his star anymore. He knows that although he may be the first person to see a new star, it is impossible for him to see the birth of a star from its beginning to its appearance. But he doesn't care because a new star has just entered his life. But we haven't thought of a name, says Anna, holding a tiny baby in her arms. I have, says Henry. I've got a beautiful name for her. What is it? Stella. Let's call her Stella.